Welcome, my name's Marleen Westerveld. Today I'm going to talk about the speech-to-print profile. Let's get started. First of all, let me start by pointing out the importance of reading success, because that's what the speech-to-print profile is all about. As we know, literacy is a basic human right. And what we also know is that the level of reading achievement, so how well you do in reading, is a big predictor of later educational success as well as psychosocial well-being. So we initiated the Reading Success Project back in 2018. And the aim of the project was really to introduce teachers to the simple view of reading, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, to profile students' strengths and weaknesses, or strengths and challenges in reading-related skills. We wanted to introduce a stepped approach based on this theoretical framework to facilitate implementation. Now, the book that we published actually describes the project as it was implemented in one specific school in metropolitan Brisbane. So, what is the simple view of reading? You've heard about this before. So, it says that reading comprehension is the product of word recognition and language comprehension. So, reading comprehension is really the ability to extract and construct linguistically based meaning, both literal and inferred from written text. Now, of course, because it's a times, not a plus, there are none of those can be zero, right? No word recognition means no reading comprehension. No language comprehension means no reading comprehension. There are also unique contributions of word recognition and listening comprehension to reading comprehension, which really means that we need to assess both of those to make sure that we have good supportive skills for reading comprehension. And then finally, we know that there are changing contributions over time. So, for example, in the early years of reading, our word recognition skills are developing, and we need very little sort of linguistic comprehension to understand what we are reading, because generally speaking, those sort of written texts during that, especially that first year of school, are quite simple. So even children with quite sort of low language comprehension skills would be able to comprehend what they're reading as long as they can decode. Of course, once children have learned to decode accurately and fluently, usually by the end of their sort of second or third year of schooling, that's when we really find that linguistic comprehension will have the biggest influence on reading comprehension. So what is language comprehension? Let's just quickly zoom through some of these definitions. So language comprehension is the ability to extract and construct literal and inferred meaning from linguistic discourse represented in speech. And this then happens at word, sentence and discourse level. So it's not just the information that is explicitly mentioned in spoken paragraphs, for example, but it's also those inferred meanings, sort of linking back to our background knowledge, or linking back to a previous sentence in that particular paragraph. And as Tanmer and Hoover then said, reading comprehension and language comprehension are sort of defined in a parallel fashion in that simple view of reading model, because both engage the same cognitive processes, except of course there are different points of access, one through print and the other one through speech. Then we have word recognition as the second sort of major component in the simple view of reading, and that's the ability to derive accurately and quickly a representation from printed input that allows access to the appropriate word meaning contained in that internal mental lexicon. And you will have covered that particularly in some of your adult language classes. So what we look for then is we look for word reading accuracy, so how well can a child decode a specific word, as well as word reading fluency. So once children become more accurate in decoding, we want to make sure that they can read fluently and that their decoding doesn't sort of remain in that very laborious sort of spelling out stage of development. Now, if we use the simple view of reading, then we can sort of divide our student needs into 4 different sort of profiles, right? So if we look at the left top quadrant, then children with dyslexia would have poor word recognition. So you can see word recognition is on the horizontal axis from poor to good. And then they would have poor word recognition and good language comprehension, right? So they would typically be called children with dyslexia or specific word recognition difficulties. Then if we look at the right top quadrant, we have proficient readers. They're good language comprehenders and they're good at word recognition. But then if we look at some other profiles of children with reading difficulties, we have children with mixed reading difficulties. So their reading comprehension difficulties can be explained by both difficulties in word recognition as well as language comprehension. And then we've got a group of students, and it's about sort of up to 17% of poor readers who will have good word recognition but poor language comprehension. So they can decode accurately and fluently, but when you ask them questions about the written material, they cannot answer them as well as their grade sort of equivalent peers. So of course, the simple view of reading doesn't really help us understand what sort of the underlying skills are that we need for reading comprehension, or language comprehension and word recognition, I should say. So Tammer and Hoover then introduced the Cognitive Foundations framework, and that more clearly outlined the cognitive capacities underlying learning to read. So this is actually a really nice basis for assessment, and it's linked to evidence-based instructional strategies for addressing individual learning needs. And you will be familiar with most, if not all, of these definitions, right? So we have language comprehension and word recognition as our major components. And then for language comprehension, we need good, solid linguistic knowledge. And then we need, that includes phonological knowledge, syntactic knowledge, and semantic knowledge, as well as background knowledge. And I'm going to come back to that in the next slide. And then for word recognition, we need alphabetic coding skills. We need to know orthographic knowledge. We need to have orthographic knowledge. So knowing what sound letters make and knowing some of those conventions, like a K and an N in English is produced as N, pronounced as N. We need good phonemic awareness. So that's sort of the an underlying component skill of phonological awareness. And then you need concepts about print, and that's usually in those early years when children are developing, you know, reading from left to right in our English language, of course, and also knowing, you know, that words have meaning and that you can decode words, and that we those are the major components. Okay. So the Cognitive Foundation framework, then, it's not a flow chart, it's also not a house. Some people like a house. And one can develop knowledge and skills at several levels at the same time. So we don't have to wait for children to build those sort of, what it almost looks like those foundational skills right at the bottom before we can go to the next level. What it does do is it provides direction for assessment. And as I said before, linked to evidence-based instructional strategies, so that we can then address individual learning needs in children who struggle in their reading. So let's look at language comprehension in a little bit more detail, right? Because how does that actually work? So the spoken language comprehension process begins with the acoustic signal, right, as you can see on the left-hand side, and then the sound waves produced by speech that arrive at the ear, right? That's what that means. That signal is then converted into a sequence of discrete abstract units called phonemes through the process of speech perception. Phonemes represent the basic units in a language that mark differences in meanings, as shown by the distinctly different meanings of the spoken words, for example, bad and pad, which differ in their initial phonemes. Then we go to a structural representation of sentences and associated propositions. So we put them together into sentence, and sentence comprehension kicks in. And then we look at the pragmatic and inferential rules, and that's when our contextual knowledge becomes really important, right? So for example, if we talk about a big bad wolf, then if we know that wolves could actually eat people, for example, going back to my Three Little Pigs example, then that's where our background knowledge kicks in and really helps us fully understand the meaning of language. If you're interested in reading this in a little bit more detail, I strongly suggest you read the paper by Tanmer and Hoover. So then underpinning word recognition, as I said before, you need the ability to map letters or letters combinations onto phonological forms. Beginning readers must, of course, acquire alphabetic coding skills for starters. And then they go from analytic to automatic word recognition skills. You may have heard, maybe not, of the self-teaching hypothesis. And that basically means once you've learned to read, the more you read, the better you get. And that's an important principle to keep in mind when we're providing intervention, right? Because it's often the kids who struggle in their reading acquisition or struggle decoding words who actually don't like reading, and they don't get as much exposure to reading as children who are competent readers do. Of course, it's not as enjoyable, right? But the more you read, it's that self-teaching hypothesis, it becomes more fluent, accurate and fluent. However, and of course the knowledge of the alphabetic principle relies on knowledge and phonemic awareness. We definitely need good, strong phonemic awareness, and that includes things like blending and segmenting. And we talked about that last trimester. Okay. Of course, apart from all that, we cannot underestimate the importance of students' prior knowledge and skills associated with a diverse range of literacies, and their personal motivation, self-perception of reading, and their confidence, but also the home and community environments. And we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the home literacy environment, for example. And then, of course, there's the teaching environment. You know, what resources are available in the classroom, what knowledge does the teacher bring, and then the quality of instruction as well. Okay, so I'm going to move back to discussing the Reading Success Project in a little bit more detail. I know that I first introduced you to this earlier, but we want to unpack how these theoretical frameworks were applied in a school context. So what we did is we introduced a 5-step assessment to intervention process. So step 1, what we do is we assess children's reading skills, and I'm going to unpack, of course, each of these steps in a bit more detail in the following slides. But step 1, it's an assessment of reading skills, and we use a standardized reading test. Then step 2, we conduct further assessments of students who score below expectations in reading comprehension, right? And then step 3, again, we might conduct further assessment depending on how the children actually perform on step 2. Step 4, we create speech-to-print profiles for those students who show difficulties in reading comprehension. And then step 5 is we would provide targeted intervention. And once we've done that, we evaluate the effectiveness of our intervention by going back to step 1, where we reassess the child's reading comprehension skills. So reading comprehension is our ultimate goal, successful reading comprehension. All right, so step 1, we assess reading skills using the YAAC. And why we use the YAAC is because it assesses both reading comprehension, reading accuracy, and reading rate, so the ability to read fluently, all in one test. There are other tests available, such as the WIAT. Just make sure that reading comprehension is also tested at that paragraph level. So it's the ability to accurately read passages, not just simple sentences, Because remember, ultimately, we want to understand whole paragraphs or whole passages of text. So step 2 then, further assessment to categorize reading profiles. So we only conduct step 2 with children or students whose reading comprehension score is below expectations, right? And what we do, think back to the simple view of reading, we will check language comprehension and we will check students' reading accuracy, their word recognition skills. What we used for language comprehension, we used the cell 4, now the cell 5, understanding spoken paragraphs. Because think back to that, the parallels between language comprehension and reading comprehension, we really want to assess language comprehension beyond the sentence level. So any test that would look at understanding of paragraph discourse level language will be fine. And then we want to check the students' reading accuracy. And what we did is we then looked at the reading accuracy results on the YARC. So, step 3, we then have a question. Does the student score below expectations in reading accuracy? And as I said, we used the YARC, but you could use different measures. If so, then we want to conduct further assessment to check the child's word recognition skills, right? And we want to go to different levels. We want to look at the child's single word reading to see if they can accurately decode words, single words. We use the Castles and Coulthard, and all of these tests are mentioned in the Reading Success book, and I'll direct you to that later. For orthographic knowledge, we use the letter sound test, also available through Motive, and I'll point you to that later. And for phonological awareness or phonemic awareness, we looked at a Sutherland Phonological Awareness Test Revised, which goes up to, I think it's the 3rd year of schooling. Or we used a comprehensive test of phonological processing, 2nd edition, for children who are older. Okay, now with all of these results, we can start to create a speech-to-print profile. So it's basically one A4 sheet to have a quick overview, and sometimes we actually use like a traffic light system, whether you like it or not, with green means it's achieved, and red means it's not, and orange means, you know, at risk. This is completely up to you in the school you work in, right? But what we did then is we start filling in this profile from right to left, so much for print concepts. So we start with text level written language on the right hand side. We fill in the child's performance on reading accuracy from the YARC, that's what we used, reading comprehension or reading fluency. Now, of course, if the child has already been assessed by the teacher, we're not going to redo the assessments. We're just going to find out. We collaborate with everyone else to try and fill out this speech-to-print profile using and trying not to sort of overuse our limited resources. So the next step would then be the word level word recognition abilities, or the word level reading abilities. So we want to look, and that was in our step 3, so we want to look at word recognition. We divide it, of course, into regular word reading, which is tells you whether a child can accurately decode regular words such as bad, for example, or spoon. Then we want to look at non-word reading, and that really shows us whether the child can apply orthographic knowledge as well as phonological awareness skill to decoding non-words such as both, for example. And irregular word reading really looks at the child's ability to recognize, we could call them sight words if you like. So there are words like yacht. We also want to look at rule and concept knowledge. So we look at grapheme phoneme correspondences. We look at orthographic knowledge like single letters, digraphs, trigraphs, and diphthongs. And of course, especially with the younger cohort, we would look at print concepts, as you can see on the top. And we really don't want to forget about, and I haven't sort of pointed it out, but spelling, the child's ability to spell regular and irregular as well as non-word spelling words. And quite often the teachers will have that information, so that is to see whether the child can again apply those orthographic knowledge rules and their phonological awareness skills to spell, especially non-word spelling. And remember, we looked at the SPAT-R last trimester. That's got a non-word spelling section, and that would definitely, you could record the results of that particular test under those headings. Okay, so that's the written language side. So what about the spoken language side? Let's open that bit up. So, spoken language. There are lots of skills that we need as per that Cognitive Foundation framework. So first of all, for children who struggle in reading comprehension, we want to check their language comprehension. So we want to start with knowledge. We want to look at their vocabulary, their syntax, their morphology, as well as their text structure knowledge, right? So text structure knowledge has to do with, for example, the macro structure in narratives or expository passages. And phonology also comes under spoken language knowledge, right? Is the child all right producing multisyllabic structures, for example? Or does the child still have phonological delay or phonological disorder? Then we want to check out on the child's phonological processing skills. So here we put down phonological awareness at phoneme, onset rhyme and syllable level. And we want to look at storage and retrieval. So if the child struggles in phonological awareness and phonology, we may want to go a little bit deeper and look at the child's ability to repeat non-words and, as I said before, multisyllabic word repetition. And there's also a rapid naming label that really looks at the child's ability to rapidly retrieve spoken words. And there's an example in the self where the child is asked to name as quickly as possible. There is like a sheet with lots of different colors, different shapes, to quickly and rapidly name those within 1 minute. Because if you think about it, it's an important skill when you're rapidly retrieving written words and you want to read accurately and fluently. Okay, now after all that, when we've completed that, and I'll show you a completed one in a minute, by outlining some case studies, right? And I'm going to briefly show you Will and Hannah. So the teacher, they were both in year 4 at the school, and the teacher had identified reading difficulties in both students, but wasn't quite sure what to do about it, how to best support these two students. So first of all, here's Hannah, and Hannah will be our case during the language and literacy workshops for the primary school years. So Hannah's 9/8, year 4. She doesn't have English as an additional language. She doesn't come from an indigenous or a Torres Strait Islander background. Her reading accuracy is 73 standard score, so that's well below 1 standard deviation. Her reading rate is even below a standard score of 70, and her reading comprehension is the same. She has significant difficulties. If we wanted to put an age equivalent on it, it would be approximately 6 years of age. No form of verification of language impairment, so she'd never been flagged with a language learning difficulty. So we first looked at her spoken language, of course, phonological awareness and storage and retrieval, as well as her written language, right? So this is just a simplified version of that speech to print profile that I showed you earlier. And as you can see, her reading comprehension, we could put it in red. We may not want to show the parents these ones, but it's really for us to sort of have a good idea of, okay, what's the difficulty here? reading comprehension was a big red flag. And then when we look at the rest of her reading profile, take a few seconds to take this in. So, Hannah shows significant difficulties in both reading comprehension and reading accuracy. So we checked that in step 2. Then when we looked at her reading comprehension, her language comprehension, so that's the spoken language knowledge side, we can see that she struggled in her spoken language skills. So here we have a student who, at step 2, showed difficulties in both the components of language comprehension and word recognition. Then in step 3, what we did is we looked at her word recognition skills. And what we can see is that she had significant difficulties in word recognition as well as orthographic knowledge. So our speech to print profile, then we completed that by looking at her phonological awareness skills. They were actually within normal limits when we used a test of phonemic awareness, but she had significant difficulties in storage and retrieval of phonological information. So we will unpack Hannah's assessment results during the workshops. But straight away, if we wanted to classify her reading difficulties, we would consider her to have mixed reading difficulties profile. So let's now turn to Will. Will is the same age, same class, 9-7, doesn't have English as an additional language. The YAC reading accuracy only 71, reading rate below 70, reading comprehension a standard score of 79. So no wonder the teacher actually was concerned about both Will and Hannah as having significant reading difficulties. Again, Will had not been verified with a language learning difficulty or a language impairment, as they call it. So let's look at his profile. As you can see, in step 1, we found significant reading comprehension difficulties, and that's in the bright red on the right-hand side. You'll learn to read from right to left in this profile. He had significant reading accuracy difficulties at text level and reading rate. But look at his spoken language skills on the left-hand side. Will actually showed adequate to strong spoken language skills. So we then went on to assess his word recognition skills and his orthographic knowledge in step 3. And we found that he had associated spoken language difficulties in storage and retrieval of phonological information. So Will's profile, and the white ones were ones that we at that stage didn't assess. So Will's profile resembles specific word reading difficulties or dyslexia. So as you can see here, we had 2 students, same class, both with significant reading comprehension difficulties, but a very different profile of reading difficulty, which really influences the types of support that we would give to these 2 students. So step 5 of our assessment to intervention process is then to look at intervention initiatives. And what we did in the project itself, we initiated a small-scale project based on the children's reading profiles. And then our focus was really on showing how children's performance guided the intervention they received. So we didn't set out to demonstrate effectiveness of interventions. We just wanted to demonstrate to the teachers and to our colleagues how a good assessment really drives intervention. So with some kids we focused on comprehension, some kids on phonological processing, and some kids on orthographic knowledge, depending on their specific strengths and challenges. So very briefly then, the comprehension kids, the children with below average reading comprehension participated in a 6-week intervention focusing on expository discourse. This was delivered by the speech pathologist, and involved content and topics from the classroom. And it was based on a study by Clark et al. So for now, just have a look at it. I'm going to come back to this probably before the third workshop when we look at discourse-based intervention. Phonological processing. The kids with specific word reading difficulties participated in a 6-week intervention focusing on phonological processing. It was firmly based on the previous work by Gail Gillen and Barbara Dodd. And again, it was delivered by the school speech pathologist. And then orthographic knowledge. The 12 children with specific word reading difficulties also received intervention for orthographic knowledge. And we actually used a Reading Doctor app, Letter Sounds 2 Pro, which is absolutely fantastic. The students loved it. It was automatic. It's collated results. And we could program it individually based on each student's results on that letter sound knowledge test. You will understand that teaching kids letter sounds is actually quite boring and laborious and hard to keep the kids motivated while they love the app and made very, very good progress. And all these initiatives have, of course, been described in the Reading Success book. So, in summary then, hopefully you can see that high quality assessment will reveal individual profiles of strengths and challenges in reading. And it allows us for targeted intervention at a level appropriate for specific students. It really improved teacher understanding of which skills to address in reading intervention and who should be involved. And actually providing those short evidence-based targeted intervention resulted in an improvement in the skills that were addressed in intervention. So again, we could demonstrate quality assessment drives intervention practices. So, in summary, I'm going to leave you with some of the comments that we received from people involved in the project. So the school leader mentioned, we started to really value the speech-language pathologist more. And we appreciated how to use all the resources around us more effectively. The speech pathologist said, it was nice to give teachers specific information on what individual students need to really assist differentiation. And it really helped us collaborate or work together better. The teacher says, we are gathering so much data, but it's not always the right data. We were blown away by the speech-to-print profiles. Actually, teachers loved it. So the department talks about being data literate, which just puts pressure on teachers. So when we showed the teachers, we did a workshop and we showed them the different speech-to-print profiles associated with the kids in their classrooms. They actually really liked that traffic light system. To see sort of in a couple of seconds what the underlying challenges might be. And then one teacher said it was a really positive experience and I felt like I really did learn a lot of new information at that workshop. Awesome. So I'm going to leave you with 2 whole pages of key references. But of course, as I said to you before, we are going to run through Hannah's case during the workshops, and we're going to look at her assessment results. We're going to look at what kind of assessments you can use to complete the speech-to-print profile, and then we're going to come up with goals and we'll do some intervention planning. Thanks for listening.